Breaking news. Davos exposes NATO's collapse and EU submission. It is Saturday, January 24, 2026, and the geopolitical map of Europe has just been redrawn. Not on a battlefield, but in a backroom deal that has left, well, pretty much everyone stunned. Before we get into this earth-shattering revelation, I want to take a moment to speak to everyone listening who cares about freedom and sovereignty. If you believe in a strong Europe and a free Ukraine, you need to stay informed. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. I'm Alex. Join me with Arya in the latest podcast by Defense Report for a sharp, no-nonsense breakdown of the latest in global defense news, military technology, and strategic developments. And today we're going to cover the absolute bombshell that just dropped at the Davos Forum. We are talking about a secret deal involving the United States, the European Union, and the total surrender of sovereignty over Greenland. And when I say surrender, I mean it. We are looking at a scenario where a G7 nation, Denmark, has effectively lost control over its own territory. And the terrifying part—
your prime minister didn't even know the details until it was all too late.
It's a moment that I think history books are really going to mark as a turning point. And honestly, it's a dark day for the concept of European independence.
We're going to look at the hammer and anvil strategy the U.S. used to break European resistance, and what this capitulation means for the future of the alliance. If you think your borders are safe because you're in NATO, well, you need to think again.
Our mission today is to analyze the source documents titled, "What Contradictions in the North Atlantic Alliance and the EU Did the Davos Forum Reveal?" We need to answer a pretty terrifying question. Is NATO still a defense alliance, or has it, mutated into something else entirely? And specifically, what does this weakness mean for the ongoing struggle for freedom in Ukraine and across Europe? Because if the EU cannot protect Denmark, how can it possibly stand up for Kiev?
So let's dive straight into the deep end here. The headline coming out of our source material is bleak. It explicitly states that NATO has ceased to be an effective defense alliance. Now that is a massive claim to make about the most powerful military bloc in history. Is this just hyperbole, or is the alliance actually broken?
It's not hyperbole if you look at the function rather than the form. I mean, the tanks are there, the soldiers are there, but the purpose has fundamentally shifted. The source documents from Davos argue that NATO has taken a fatal hit. It's no longer operating as a collective shield. It has been relegated to, and I'm quoting here, a mere arm-twisting organization in the hands of the U.S.
Arm twisting. That implies coercion. It implies that the members aren't, walking in step, but that one member is dragging the others along.
Precisely. To understand this, we have to look at the American perspective, specifically the stance coming from the Trump administration. For years, we've heard the complaints about budget contributions, the famous 2% rule, but what we're seeing now in 2026 is an evolution of that grievance. The U.S. argument has solidified into a belief that, Europe needs NATO much, much more than the U.S. does.
Which, strategically speaking, there's some truth to it, right? I mean, the U.S. has two oceans protecting it. Europe has a land war on its border in Ukraine.
That's the leverage point. But it's the aggression of the stance that's new. The source quotes Trump reportedly stating that NATO would not come to the U.S.'s defense if required. That is a fundamental breach of trust. The core of Article 5 is one for all for one. But the rhetoric now is that the U.S. is doing all the heavy lifting for a continent that won't lift a finger in return.
There is a specific detail in the notes about Afghanistan that I found really striking. It feels like the U.S. is rewriting history a bit to justify this new hostility.
Oh, it's deeply damaging. The source highlights a claim by Trump that NATO troops stayed a little off the front lines in Afghanistan. He's using that to justify the view that the alliance has lost its worth to America.
That's just incredibly insulting to the British, Canadian, Danish, and Estonian soldiers, among many others, who fought and died in Helmand Province.
It is insulting, and factually, it's contentious at best. But in terms of realpolitik, the truth matters less than the narrative. And the narrative in Washington is that the alliance is a bad transaction. The U.S. feels shortchanged. So the mindset shifts from how do we defend our allies to how do we use this alliance to get what we want. And what they wanted, in this case, was total control over the Arctic approach.
Right, let's talk about the prize here. Why Greenland? Why does the U.S. care so much about this particular piece of ice and rock that they're willing to humiliate a close ally like Denmark to get it?
It's about two things: the GI-UK gap and resources.
The GI-UK gap.
Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. It's the naval choke point that the Russian Northern Fleet has to pass through to get to the Atlantic. If you control Greenland, you control the North Atlantic. But it's also about the future. As the ice melts, new shipping lanes open up, And we know Greenland is sitting on massive deposits of rare earth minerals, the stuff we need for batteries, for chips, for advanced weaponry.
So this is about blocking Russia militarily and competing with China economically.
Exactly. The U.S. decided that securing those assets was more important than diplomatic niceties. And that brings us to the mechanism of how they force the EU's hand. The source uses this vivid, almost medieval imagery. Tariffs were the anvil, NATO was the hammer.
I want to really break this down because that sounds like a very specific diplomatic maneuver. How does the hammer and anvil actually work in practice?
Okay, so visualize the European Union as a piece of metal, or maybe a piece of glass, considering how fragile it turned out to be caught between two forces. The anvil is the economic reality. The U.S. threatened massive, crushing tariffs on European goods.
We're talking a full-on trade war.
A trade war that would decimate the German auto industry, French luxury goods, Italian manufacturing. The European economy is already teetering. A full-blown trade war with the U.S. would be catastrophic.
So the EU is resting on this anvil. They can't move because the economic cost is just too high.
Right. That creates the immobility. Then comes the hammer. The hammer is NATO itself. The U.S. used the security alliance, the very thing meant to keep Europe safe, as the weapon to strike the blow. The ultimatum was essentially, give us what we want geopolitically, or we break the alliance and crush your economy.
It's a shakedown. It's essentially saying, nice economy you have there would be a shame if you lost your security umbrella.
It's a brutal metaphor, but it captures the reality. The source material says the EU capitulated. They fell in line to avoid the tariffs. They sacrificed geopolitical autonomy to keep the alliance intact. But you have to ask yourself, what kind of alliance is kept intact by force?
It sounds more like a hostage situation than a partnership. And the source documents are incredibly harsh on the EU leadership here. They use words like toothless, spineless, and subservient.
They are harsh words, but are they wrong? Look at the facts. The EU is a bloc of 27 nations. It is an economic superpower. And yet, it could not negotiate from a position of strength regarding a member state's territory. Instead of protecting Denmark, instead of standing as a unified bloc saying sovereignty is non-negotiable, the EU allowed the US to bulldoze through just to pacify Trump.
That's the part that keeps coming back to me. Denmark is a member of the EU. It's a member of NATO. If the EU can't stand up for Denmark, how can we expect them to hold the line for Ukraine? Ukraine isn't even in the club yet.
That is the terrifying implication. Strength is about perception. By caving in on Greenland, the EU has signaled that its principles are up for sale if the price is right or if the threat is big enough. It signals to Moscow that European resolve is fragile. If tariffs were enough to make the EU sell out a member state, what would energy blackmail do? What would a cyber attack do?
It validates the worldview of dictators. It tells Putin that might makes right, and that the West's talk of a rules-based order is just fluff.
Exactly. It undermines the moral authority of the entire Western project. We are telling Ukraine to fight for every inch of their land, while we are giving away thousands of square miles of ours in a backroom deal.
Let's get into the specifics of what was actually traded away, because the details are shocking. The deal is for total and permanent access to Greenland.
Total and permanent. Those words should send a shiver down everyone's spine.
But hasn't the U.S. always been there? I mean, we all know about Thule Air Base. It's been there since the Cold War. So how is this 2026 deal different from the 1951 Defense Treaty?
It's the difference between being a guest and being the landlord. In 1951, the U.S. had access, but it was limited, and crucially, it was with the consent of Denmark. There was a legal framework that respected Danish sovereignty.
Right, they had to ask.
They had to ask. If the U.S. wanted to expand a runway, they had to ask.
And now?
Now, according to the source, the U.S. needs no formal permission for new bases. They can start mining anywhere they like. They can expand into any area they require for strategic purposes.
Wait. So if the U.S. decides they need a new missile silo right next to a Greenlandic fishing village, or they want to strip mine a glacier for uranium, Denmark can't say no.
That is what total access means. The source is explicit. Denmark and Greenland do not have sovereignty over the island anymore in a practical sense. Sovereignty is the ability to say no. If you cannot control who enters your territory, where they go, or what they extract from the ground, you are not sovereign. You are occupied.
And the most shocking part of this, the part that really highlights the betrayal, is the communication breakdown. Or rather, the total lack of communication.
It's unbelievable. We have a direct quote from the Greenlandic Prime Minister in the source material. He said, and I quote, "I don't know what there is in the agreement or the deal about my country."
Just let that sink in for a second. The leader of the country involved, the person elected to protect that land, He didn't know the terms of the deal.
It highlights the absurdity and the tragedy of the situation. This wasn't a deal between Denmark and the US. This was a deal brokered by the NATO Secretary General directly with Washington. They bypassed Copenhagen. They bypassed Nuuk. They treated Greenland not as a home to people, but as a strategic asset on a risk board.
So NATO, the organization meant to defend the sovereignty of its members, actually facilitated the stripping of sovereignty from one of its members.
Yes, that's the contradiction the source points out. Denmark and Greenland are running around claiming sovereignty is a red line, but the source argues this is a hollow statement. The red line was already crossed, erased, and redrawn by Washington and NATO headquarters without them even being in the room.
It leaves them high and dry. The source mentions a really cynical point, that Denmark might be regretting not just accepting Trump's offer to buy Greenland outright a few years ago.
It's cynical, but look at the math. A few years ago, Trump offered to buy the island. It was treated as a joke, an insult. But if they had sold it, they would have received billions of dollars. Financial compensation that could have secured their social state for generations. Now, they have lost control over the territory, the US has total access, and Denmark gets nothing. Zero. Just the humiliation of being sidelined.
And the EU gets to avoid tariffs.
Right. The EU heaved a sigh of relief, as the source puts it, but it's a relief bought with dignity. They saved the German car exports, but they lost their soul.
I want to pivot back to what you mentioned earlier about the bigger picture. We're looking at this through the lens of defense and security. If NATO can be used to force a member state to give up territorial control to the US just to avoid tariffs, what does that mean for the rest of Europe?
It sets a devastating precedent. We call it the slippery slope, but this is more like a cliff edge. If Article 5 is the shield against foreign aggression, what is the shield against internal coercion? There isn't one.
If I'm sitting in Warsaw or Tallinn or Bucharest right now, I have to be looking at this with horror. These countries rely on the absolute certainty of NATO's protection and the EU's solidarity. But we just watched the EU throw Denmark under the bus to save its economic metrics.
You have to be terrified, because the logic used here, the hammer and anvil, can be applied to anyone. If Poland disagrees with US policy on China, could the US threaten to pull air defense batteries unless Warsaw capitulates? This deal proves that security is now transactional.
And this brings us back to Ukraine. We said at the start that we support Ukraine and we support a strong Europe, but a Europe that acts like this is not strong.
It's weak, and weakness is provocative. Ukraine is fighting a blood-soaked war for the very concept of sovereignty, the right to exist, the right to choose your own alliances. We in the West support them, we fund them, we tell them their fight is our fight, and then simultaneously we allow the sovereignty of Greenland to be dismantled because it was politically convenient for the G7 powers.
It makes our promises sound hollow.
It does. And for the people of Ukraine who are dying to be part of these institutions, NATO and the EU, this must be a confusing, heartbreaking moment. They are fighting to join a club that just demonstrated it won't protect the rights of its smaller members against the larger ones.
Though, arguably, they need the protection even more now. If the world is shifting to pure power politics, you definitely don't want to be the one standing alone outside the alliance, even if the alliance is flawed.
That's the tragic irony. Being inside the tent, even if the landlord is a bully, is still safer than being out in the storm with the Russian bear. But the idealism, the idea of a Europe whole and free, that took a fatal hit in Davos this week.
So let's summarize this new normal the source talks about. The EU is subservient, NATO is an arm-twisting organization, and the US has achieved its strategic goals through coercion.
Yes. Mission accomplished for Washington. They got the strategic depth of Greenland. They secured the Arctic against Russia and China. Strategically, for America, it's a massive win. They played hardball and they won.
But for the concept of a free and united Europe,
it's a disaster. It confirms that the EU is, as the source says, a toothless and spineless body. And I want to emphasize, I don't say that with joy. I say that with deep concern. A toothless Europe is a danger to itself and to its friends.
Especially to Ukraine. If the EU cannot stand up to its friends, it certainly cannot stand up to its enemies.
Exactly. If the EU buckles under tariff threats from Washington, will they buckle under energy threats from somewhere else? It suggests that European unity is fragile and can be broken with enough pressure.
It makes you wonder if there's any red line left that Europe wouldn't cross if the pressure was high enough.
That is the question that keeps me up at night. The source says Denmark and Greenland called sovereignty a red line, but it was ignored. If that red line means nothing, then do any of them.
It's a sobering realization. We always assumed the threats to sovereignty came from the outside. from tanks crossing borders, but here the threat came from inside the house. The call was coming from inside the NATO headquarters.
And that is why this Davos revelation is so critical. It strips away the comforting rhetoric of shared values and reveals the raw power dynamics underneath. We are entering an era of naked self-interest.
The source mentions that the exact details of the agreement are not even known to the Danish or Greenlandic PMs, and that we will find out in due course. That phrasing, in due course, sounds ominous.
It means we will find out when the bulldozers show up, when the fences go up, when the exclusion zones are declared. It's governance by ambush.
It really changes how we have to look at the next few years. We are entering an era where the EU is effectively a vassal to US interests, paying tribute in the form of sovereignty to keep the economic engine running.
Now we have to ask, where does it stop? Today it is Greenland, it's remote, it's sparsely populated, it's easy for people in Berlin or Paris to ignore, but the mechanism, the hammer and anvil, is proven now. It works.
That's the scary part. Once you use a weapon effectively, you tend to use it again.
Exactly. What if the next demand isn't about territory? What if it's about trade policy with China? Or data privacy laws? Or environmental regulations? The U.S. has established that it can use NATO security guarantees as leverage to force EU capitulation on non-defense issues.
It turns the entire post-World War II order on its head. NATO is supposed to be the shield that allowed democracy to flourish. Now it's the cudgel used to beat democracies into submission.
And we need to be clear. This puts Ukraine in an incredibly difficult spot. They rely on U.S. aid, they rely on EU support. If those two entities are at odds, or if the EU is being subjugated by the US, Ukraine gets caught in the gears. A weak Europe cannot help Ukraine win. Only a strong, sovereign Europe can do that. And right now, Europe looks very, very weak.
We're running short on time, but I want to circle back to the quote from the Greenland Prime Minister one last time. I don't know what there is in the agreement.
It's the epitaph of the alliance of equals.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that information is power, and in this deal, the European leaders were kept in the dark.
And if they don't know what they signed away, we certainly don't know the full extent of it yet.
That leads us to the final thought for today.
Here is what I want everyone to think about as they go about their weekend. The exact details of this agreement are still unknown, even to the leaders involved. If total access can be granted to a foreign power without the host country's permission today, what other assets or territories could be negotiated away tomorrow to keep the alliance alive? Could we see rights to the Baltic Sea compromised? Could we see trade routes in the Mediterranean bargained away? Once you start paying protection money, the price usually only goes up.
A chilling thought, but one we have to confront. We need to stay vigilant, and we need to keep supporting those who are fighting for true sovereignty, particularly in Ukraine. Their fight is the front line of this entire struggle for self-determination. You've been listening to Defense Report by Alex and Aria, where we analyze the latest in military strategy, global defense, and advanced weaponry. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. We'll catch you next time.